Hello and welcome to Coffee and Control, the podcast where I find fascinating people from within the world of control and convince them to answer all of my questions. I'm your host, Lucy Hodgins, and as you all already know, if you already listened to part one with my guest today, he is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and host of the wonderful podcast inControl. If you haven't listened to part one, I would highly recommend listening to that first. We cover some really fascinating concepts such as moments of systems, model order reduction, dominant systems, and intuitive understandings of geometric control. Part two continues the excitement with a ton more interesting topics. So buckle up, get ready to learn all about persistence of excitation in a geometric context, data-driven modeling of nonlinear systems, how to define distances between behaviours, as well as the origin story of his podcast inControl with my guest this month, Dr. Alberto Padoan.
I'm Alberto Padoan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. My research these days lies mostly in data-driven control, although my past has spanned different directions, biological applications, nonlinear control.
So going back to your PhD work again, so I'm really interested in the work you did on persistency of excitation. So again, this links to Paulo's work, but it seems like there's quite a few differences in your approach. Here I'm referring to Professor Paulo Rapisada, who I interviewed on the podcast back in April, and whose work has a load of interesting parallels with what Alberto is working on. So from reading it, I think the three main differences I could see is the geometric perspective, nonlinear systems, and that you're looking at persistence of solutions of autonomous systems, right, rather than persistently exciting inputs. So could you give a general overview of what's the approach you were using, kind of what you were trying to achieve?
Sure. So this is actually a joint venture between myself and Giordano Scarciotti, who is now at Imperial College London. He ended up staying. We were PhD students at about the same time. He was working mostly on moment matching, and in particular, he had come up with a data-driven way of doing moment matching, meaning that you would measure measurements, and as you would measure these measurements, you would build an approximate model online. So this was extremely useful and fascinating at the time. But in running simulations, he realized that somehow mystically, in some circumstances, the models he would get were bonkers, were not useful or not really faithful of representing the original system. At the same time, as I mentioned before, I was focusing on system identification. And in system identification, the notion of persistence of excitation plays a very important role. Persistence of excitation, and we've seen it also in the last few years with the wave of data-driven control, persistency of excitation has come back. This is a property of signals that essentially say that in the frequency domain, that means that we're eliciting certain harmonics. So just to give some intuition, white noise elicits all harmonics, and so that's persistently exciting of any order. A sinusoid is persistently exciting of order 2 or 1, depending on how you define it, because you're exciting two different types of harmonics, if you look at the Fourier transform of that signal. So I was very familiar with the concept, and when I saw that phenomenon, I remember this meeting in the room of Alessandro. It was me, him, and Giordano. I was thinking, okay, this could be related to something that I've seen before. And so we joined forces with Giordano. It was a very enriching experience for me because, you know, he was 1 year ahead, and I was, I guess, right in the middle of my PhD blues. So completely hopeless. I will never make it. I will not. What did I do with my life and things of the sort. So we started working and realized that, yeah, the problem was a lack of persistence of excitation in the data. And that was the culprit of essentially preventing the algorithms or Giordano to work in the linear context. And then, of course, as always, we started thinking, okay, but what is the nonlinear version of what we are looking at? The reason is that the data in the context of Alessandro's theory of moment matching are generated by an external signal, a generator, so a system that generates these signals. And this has to do with this output regulation theory, whereby the signals generated by the signal generator essentially play the role of the poles where we want to interpolate our transfer function. This is what Alessandro showed in his paper. And yeah, we realized that under some assumptions on this signal generating system, the resulting signals that would be generated would be always persistently exciting. And it turned out, if I remember correctly, because this is a long time ago, that the property was almost periodicity of the system itself. So meaning that all trajectories are almost periodic, and that essentially means that the distance between solutions of the system and a point would be always returning back arbitrarily close to that point, essentially.
I just wanted to add a quick bit of extra information here. So, obviously, if a function f of x is periodic, then it has some period t such that f of x plus t minus f of x equals 0 for all x. For an almost periodic function, you can specify some bound epsilon, and for that bound, you can find some constant t such that f of x plus t minus f of x is less than your bound epsilon, but it will never actually be equal to 0. Now, in the traditional linear context, you can check persistency of excitation by checking the rank of a Hankel matrix. However, in his paper, Alberto presented an excitability rank condition for nonlinear systems and showed that for systems that are almost periodic, this only needed to be checked at the initial condition in order to show that the solutions would be persistently exciting. So, how can persistency of excitation be characterized geometrically, and what's the advantage of doing this?
So again, this is a long time ago, but let's see. So as I mentioned, if we think of persistency of excitation in terms of the system that generates the signal rather than the signal itself, we can essentially state something about the persistency of excitation properties of the signals generated by just knowing the vector field of, or the system description, if you want, that generated those signals. So I guess the advantage is that you would be able to say a priori, before actually computing the solutions of the system, you would be able to certify that the signals are persistently exciting. So that was the advantage of the geometric approach in that context.
So you mentioned in one of your papers that persistence of excitation also plays a crucial role in stability analysis of certain kinds of nonlinear systems. And then this paper analysed the stability of skew-symmetric systems. So what's the link between persistence of excitation and stability?
Again, this is a long time ago, but the link there was the fact that those systems naturally arise, if I remember correctly, in adaptive control schemes. And essentially, persistency of excitation in certain contexts was essentially a condition that would be helpful in certifying that a certain adaptive control scheme would converge. And there, the connection there is that if some signals are persistently exciting, then the resulting adaptive control scheme is working. So it's asymptotically stable in that context. So that would be the connection.
So your paper also discussed the link between persistently exciting signals and model order reduction. So I don't know if you wanted to kind of give an overview of how these concepts relate to each other?
I think this is related to the previous question. So under some assumptions, if I remember correctly, so in the context of, again, the framework developed by Astolfi and Giordano Scarciotti in that context, for data-driven way of computing reduced order models by moment matching, if the signal generator was not almost periodic, so in that context, specifically in the context of linear systems, it would not be such that certain harmonics would be elicited, then you wouldn't be able essentially to construct a reduced order model that would be able to achieve moment matching, meaning that the transfer function of the original system and the transfer function of the reduced order model will be equal to 0. That's actually a basic requirement. That's the reason why you do moment matching in the first principle. And so if that persistency of excitation condition does not hold, then moment matching is not possible. That's what we showed in that specific paper through an example.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of transition away from your PhD work to your work on data-driven representations are kind of related to behavioral systems theory. So there was a very interesting paper that you wrote on using data to construct conical, convex, and affine system models. So kind of what are these kind of models and why are they useful?
This is my most recent obsession and kind of a quest on convincing everyone that behavioral systems theory still has a lot to say. I'm not sure whether I'm on the right path, but let's see. Again, maybe here we should take a step back. Luckily, you already covered behavioral systems theory with Paolo Rapisarda. Nobody would be more qualified, or I mean, only few would be more qualified than him to talk about it. So I'm glad that he already created the context. But okay, for those who haven't listened to that episode, behavioral systems theory conceptualizes systems in terms of sets of trajectories. Summarized by the quote, the behavior is all there is. And Jan Willems, in developing that framework, I guess had to spend a lot. I mean, this is my interpretation. I didn't have the opportunity to meet him. I had just started my PhD when he unfortunately passed away. But he necessarily had to spend a lot of time while developing the behavioral systems theory approach in relating to old concepts, to old ways of doing things, particularly in the linear world. So in that case, behaviors would be represented by, for example, kernels of polynomial matrices or images under some assumptions. And, the main tool in order to say something about linear systems, which in the behavioral systems theory framework are subspaces by definition, would be to speak the language of polynomial algebra, essentially.
So, as you might expect, polynomial matrices are just matrices with polynomial coefficients. And it turns out that these are super useful in behavioral systems theory, and they can be used to test properties such as controllability and observability, as well as whether different representations correspond to the same system.
What I was not particularly enthusiastic about, after spending some time on the subject, first at the University of Padova, thanks to Ettore Fornasini, another legend of mine that convinced me to it didn't convince me, but he certainly motivated me to stay on this path. What I was not particularly, let's say, impressed was that behaviors seem to be associated to linear behaviors. And this is something that annoyed me and still annoys me, because the framework is actually very general. It's almost too general, and so general that it's difficult to say something about the nonlinear world. So we spent a lot of time, in the first part of this discussion, talking about nonlinear behaviors. And nonlinear behaviors are generally characterized in different ways, typically through state space models or most recently operators. Think about neural networks, for example. But if you adopt a behavioral perspective on systems theory, these are just representations of a system. As mentioned, the object of interest is the behavior, so the set of all possible trajectories. So the basic question I was asking when I wrote that paper, and again, trying to, motivated by pushing most recent developments in data-driven control towards a more non-linear realm, was, okay, what if I impose different assumptions on the behavior of a system that is not linearity? What are the edges of tractability? We often think that linearity makes a behavior tractable, computationally tractable, for the purpose, say, of optimization or other endeavors. But I believe that linearity is not what is needed necessarily. I think we can go beyond that. And for example, convexity, conicity, and other notions are something that still lead to tractable results, and even surprising ones.
So what kind of systems can be modeled by conical, convex, and affine models?
So there's plenty. So this is a question that I get, obviously, after writing that paper a lot, because linear systems are everywhere, and so it's very easy to make examples. But it's also very easy to make examples about nonlinear systems that have different properties. So maybe we can actually just spend a word about these different properties themselves, just defining them. So conicity means that, of a set, means that if I take an element of the set and I scale it by a non-negative quantity, I again get an element of that set. Convexity, as we know, instead means that if we take two elements and take a convex combination of these two elements of a set, I stay within the set. So the convex combination is also an element of that set. Typically, you define convex combination between two elements as 1 minus alpha, and you require that alpha is between 0 and 1 to define a convex combination. And affine systems, because this is another class of systems that I was looking at recently, simply mean that if I take an affine combination, which is essentially the same as a convex combination, but defined by the fact that alpha does not have to be in 0, 1. It can be anything on the real numbers. And so that is what defines affine sets. And affine sets can be seen essentially as shifted subspaces, so subspaces that do not pass through the origin. So where do these behaviors originate? Well, maybe I can start from affine systems. Affine systems naturally arise from linearizations. So linearizations, as we know, are extremely prevalent in systems and control because they tell us a lot about, for example, the stability properties of a system, but also have been used recently in data-driven control, for example, by researchers in Stuttgart to develop new data-driven model predictive control schemes. And this manifests in the requirement of, let's say, the elements of a certain vector have to sum to 1.
Here, Alberto was referring to the group of Frank Allgauer, and one aspect of their research aims to provide rigorous guarantees for data-driven controllers. Also, this is very much unrelated to what Alberto was talking about, but as well as doing interesting theoretical work, they've also worked on applying MPC to some very cool applications, including an autonomous e-scooter, soft robotic manipulators, and in controlling pandemic outbreaks. In particular, back in 2021, they published an interesting paper showing that MPC could be used to decrease the number of fatalities during a COVID outbreak. So the group formulated this problem kind of similar to a standard MPC problem, with social distancing measures being updated weekly. But the bound on the cost of this distancing was adapted according to how the current proposed measures would impact the future ICU capacity. So if the MPC controller predicted that capacity would be above 90%, then the upper bound on the cost of social distancing was increased. So that was just a little diversion into the uses of MPC. But before I got distracted, Alberto was talking about convex, conic, and affine behaviours. And he's about to give some funky examples of where these show up in practical applications.
Where do convex and conic behaviors arise? There are plenty as well, but I guess the most representative or the quintessential behaviors that are, let's say, conic and convex are the following. A conic behavior that I particularly like is the diode. This is an element, classical element that one sees in circuit theory. If you look at the IV curve of this diode, you see that this is essentially a reversed L-shape. It's not even a function in the classical sense. It's a relation between two variables, and that is something that is deeply satisfying for me because that is a behavior. I mean, that is really what a behavior is. It's a relation between variables. And it turns out that because of this particular L shape of the IV curve of this element, if you take a trajectory that lies in the IV curve of the diode and you scale it, you get another one. So that's a quintessential example of a conic behavior. For convex behaviors arise naturally in many contexts. If ever one of my colleagues, Jaap Eising, listens to this episode, some of the behaviors that we keep talking about recently are systems that are constrained. For example, think of unilaterally constrained mechanical systems, so systems with, let's say, a wall on either side, but also positive systems, so systems whose state, for example, is constrained to lie in an orthant, or whose variables are constrained to lie in an orthant, non-negative orthant.
For anyone who's unfamiliar, an orthant is a generalization of a quadrant to higher dimensional space. So a vector lying in a non-negative orthant would have all elements being positive.
And these systems, for example, arise very naturally in the context of, say, traffic applications, which is something that I've been looking at recently. Flows and densities are necessarily non-negative variables. You cannot have a negative number of cars going in around the street. And so, as I said, there's plenty of behaviors that have these properties. It's just that we haven't studied them in depth.
Okay, so could you give a little bit of an overview on how your paper on convex, conical, and affine system models was able to extend the ideas behind data-driven model construction of LTI systems to a kind of different or more general class of systems?
Yeah, so when I wrote this paper, I moved on to ETH Zurich, which is where I spent the last 3 years before becoming an assistant professor at PC. And there I was working with a number of very talented researchers. I was mentored and advised by Florian Dorfler and John Ligaros. Very deeply inspiring researchers, both of them for different reasons. And the buzzword in the lab, or where I spent some time in my second postdoc, was data-driven control. Data-driven control, well, mainly because one of the former members of the lab that I continue to have the pleasure of working with, Jeremy Colson, and many others, had developed this new way of doing model predictive control, of course, at the same time as others in Stuttgart and other places in the world, whereby you would replace a finite horizon system representation of a behavior that normally would be formulated through ABCD matrices in the solution of an optimal control problem that is used in model predictive control, using so-called data-driven representations, or what I would say are representations of behaviors over finite horizons. So this is the basic premise. In these schemes, one expresses, if you want, the constraint that the inputs and outputs of a system are generated by a linear system by requiring that they are in the image of a certain data matrix. Now, the reason why you can justify this from a behavioral perspective is that, as I mentioned before, systems that are linear are subspaces. So if you take restrictions over finite horizons of these possibly infinite dimensional subspaces, you get for free that you can represent these subspaces via a matrix. And it turns out that matrices that are particularly useful in this context are Hankel matrices. So what one would do in order to develop these model predictive control schemes is to collect data offline that allows you to represent the system.
So Hankel matrices are used a ton in data-driven control, and in this context, this refers to a matrix where the first row is the system trajectory, so input-output pairs over some time window, and then each subsequent row is a shifted version of this first row, meaning that you end up with each upward diagonal of the matrix being constant.
Recently, it has been showed also by some of my colleagues at ETH and in Padova, Keith Moffat and Alessandro Chiuso, that you actually don't really need to do that. You can also collect data online to build a representation of the system by organizing the data in a specific way. And so I was asking the question, again, in order to move beyond the control of linear systems, but ideally of nonlinear systems, what are the classes of systems that I can still characterize in the same way, say with an analogy to Hankel matrices, by requiring that the system satisfies different properties? What are the classes of systems that are tractable, again? And I guess as a motivating example, what I had in mind were positive systems, because positive systems are nonlinear. Even if described by ABCD matrices, the constraint that certain variables have to be non-negative essentially prevent the system being described as a subspace. And again, by definition, that means that the system is nonlinear. And so what I did was to realize that if you again, let's say, taking a system that is described by state space equations, but is also non-negative, well then, if you organize your data again into a Hankel matrix and require that you cannot take linear combinations of that data matrix to generate finite horizon trajectories, but impose some constraints on the way you take these combinations, then you could essentially extend this fundamental lemma-like representation, or Willem's fundamental lemma-related representation in terms of data matrices for classes that are not linear. And that was very surprising to me. It was very exciting. For example, in that specific paper, the message of that paper is the following. If you take into account additional structure of a system, so in this context, positivity of the variables, you can get away with less data in order to provide a system description. So if you wish, said another way, we can identify the system with less data by just taking into account more information, which makes sense. And this is something that was deeply satisfying.
So this paper's focused on developing models over finite horizons, which you've kind of mentioned. So what is the difference between finite and infinite horizon behaviors?
And that's a good question. So behavioral systems theory, as we mentioned, deals with sets of trajectories. Trajectories themselves, we haven't defined them. They are in discrete time sequences in continuous time functions. And the problem here is that if you look at subspaces of functions or subspaces of sequences, these subspaces in principle do not have finite dimension. The dimension of these subspaces is not finite. So one way you can, let's say, make these subspaces a bit more tractable, at least in discrete time, is by restricting your focus to a finite time horizon, let's say between t0 and t1, and by identifying now finite sequences with vectors, what you can do is literally characterize these subspaces in terms of matrices, images or kernels, as we mentioned. And that's the reason why the fundamental lemma of Willems that you've talked about also with Paolo in a previous episode led to the development of these, first of all, of linear quadratic tracking developed by Ivan Markovsky and Paolo Rapisarda, and then today to these new model predictive control schemes.
When I interviewed Paolo, we did briefly discuss this topic of finite horizon linear quadratic tracking in the context of data-driven control. And Paolo mentioned that using the fundamental lemma turns this problem into a trivial one of optimization over finite dimensional subspaces, which is to say that some problems are made much easier when approaching them from a data-driven behavioral framework.
I believe that these models are yet another valuable representation of systems. Again, this is a representation under some assumptions, under the assumption that, if these matrices are defined by data, the data has to respect certain properties. You also need to have enough data, otherwise it doesn't make sense. But there is a lot to say about these models. And in fact, that's what I've been working on in the past few years. I guess my paper here at ECC, I'm not sure whether I should mention that we're recording.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're recording this at ECC, leverages these representations. I'm very excited by it. It's called Split as a Pro. It's a joint effort with a number of colleagues at ETH, championed by Yu Tang, very talented student. I had the pleasure of mentoring together with Carlo Cenedese, John Ligeros, Florian Dorfler, as I mentioned, and Alessio Rimoldi, another of the students that I mentored and I'm proud of mentoring. So here we're using, again, this behavioral perspective to leverage structure, leverage prior knowledge about a system in order to make computations tractable. This is really the essence of the paper. In particular, in that context, we look at these kind of representations when a system is interconnected. And interconnections in the behavioral setting are essentially represented by, loosely speaking, intersections. The intersections of certain sets. So if I have several systems, each with their own behavior when they're isolated, I can think of the overall interconnected system as the set of all isolated systems intersected with another behavior that is defined by the interconnection equations. And so this very nice structure allows you to think about a complex interconnected system as the intersection of two very special behaviors. One that is mathematically the Cartesian product of several subsystems, and then another very special behavior that is taking care of making sure that, the input of one system is equal to the output of another system, and so on. And it turns out that after thinking about it for a while with you and all the other co-authors, you can exploit that structure. And you can exploit that structure quite a bit, at least in the context of model predictive control, but I believe also in many other dynamic optimization, so optimization of variables that lie in a certain behavior. That's how I call it these days. You can exploit it in a number of different contexts, filtering, for example, estimation, and I hope many others.
Sadly, I didn't manage to see Alberto student U present this paper at ECC, but as Alberto is about to explain, the basic idea of this paper is to reformulate the system in such a way that the computational bottleneck takes the form of a projection. And then the paper proposes a way to essentially split up this projection into a large number of simpler ones.
So there we show that essentially whenever the bottleneck is projecting onto a possibly complex behavior, if you have this nice structure of seeing the behavior of the overall interconnected system as an intersection, then you can break up the problem into essentially projecting onto two sets of behaviors that are very special. One is, as I said, the Cartesian product of the set of all possible isolated systems. And the fact that you have a Cartesian product allows you to project individually onto all of these. You can parallelize computations. The other projection that you have to compute is the projection onto this so-called network behavior or interconnections behavior, and we don't really have a name for it. But it turns out that computing projections onto behaviors of that sort is very efficient and essentially amounts to using a consensus algorithm, essentially exchanging information between neighboring systems. And so that essentially says that we can scale up computation by, again, leveraging knowledge about a possibly complex system that is possibly large scale. And I find it super exciting.
I also found this super interesting, and I was curious as to how this work fitted into Alberto's geometric understanding of behavioral systems and control.
There's a lot of geometry there too, as always. The geometry that you were using here is different though. It's the geometry of projections. And what is interesting is that the behaviors that seem to be tractable are not, again, necessarily linear behaviors, but are behaviors onto which it's easy to project. And that means that it's sets of trajectories onto which it's easy to project. We know that projections onto different types of sets are tractable. I'm thinking about now in behaviors in a very loose sense, but let's think about static behaviors to fix ideas. Projections on affine sets, we can compute them explicitly in closed form. Projections onto boxes that typically arise as, for example, actuation, saturation, or projections onto orthants are also very tractable. And again, non-negative positive systems come to mind. So tractability does not seem to stop at linearity. Well, there seems to be something beyond, and I'm particularly curious about the beyond, if you want.
So there's kind of one technical section that I'd like to ask you about, and then talking about inControl after that.
Sure.
So the final technical thing, your papers on distances between linear behaviours. So there's a paper that was titled Behavioural Certainty Quantification for Data-Driven Control, where you develop a metric that kind of acted as a finite time counterpart of the classical gap metric. So could you give like a bit of a background on classical gap metrics? I know you talked about it a bit in the most recent inControl episode.
Yeah.
The episode I'm referring to here is episode 33 with Mathakumali Vidyasagar, which gave a really interesting overview of the classical gap metric. But I was curious as to why this couldn't be applied to finite time behaviours and how the work that Alberto had done extended this framework. Also, if you listened right to the end of last month's episode, I mentioned that there was one paper that Alberto had written that I got super excited about when I read it. It was this paper. It's really cool.
So if there's one paper, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's the most important one, but if there's one paper that summarizes my trajectory in one shot, that's the one. And the reason is that somehow all of my knowledge coalesces into a single paper. First of all, the geometry that comes from, all the studying that I've done in my PhD. Then my time at Cambridge, where I got to learn about the frequency domain approach to systems theory a bit more in depth, and in particular about the gap metric and the new gap metric pioneered by Malcolm Smith and Glenn Vinicombe and many others at Cambridge, that essentially, again, looked at systems in terms of subspaces and looked at natural ways of measuring distances between subspaces. I'll talk about that in a second. And finally, the third element is behaviors. So in this context, the reason why we want to quantify uncertainty in a behavioral setting is that linear time invariant systems are naturally described by linear shift invariant subspaces. So it is natural to ask, how do I understand how far a system is from another one? And as I mentioned, there are more or less natural ways of computing distances between subspaces. I believe that the intrinsic way of computing distances is through canonical angles. Now, the simplest way to think about this, again, is if I have two lines in the plane and they intersect at the origin, I have no way of measuring how far they are because they intersect in a certain sense. So if I were to say what is the point that is less distant from another one that belongs to both, it will be zero, because by definition they both pass through zero, these two lines. So there must be a different way to say that these two objects are either the same or different. Intuitively, the two objects are the same. These two lines are one overlapped onto another one. And if they are maximally distant, or if they are maximally different, they would be one perpendicular to the other. So it's clear that the right notion of measuring how two subspaces relate to each other is defined by the angles they define. So if I only have one dimension, if we're living in the plane, and I have two lines or two systems, two subspaces that are intersecting at the origin, then I only have one angle. But if I have subspaces that are of dimension more than one, then necessarily I will have more than one angle. And so, yeah, the natural way for me, at least, to characterize how far two system representations are from one another is in terms of angles. And the paper that you just described was the first attempt to think about how do we characterize differences or uncertainty between two systems, is using one possible metric between subspaces, and that's the gap metric. That's the one that I had seen during my time at Cambridge. And it's basically the sign of the largest angle between two subspaces. But it's not the only one. There's different metrics, and I think that by now I have convinced myself that the use of the metric should be matched to the task that you're intending to solve. In fact, I have another paper, I think, coming out at CDC, LCSS, with Jeremy Colson, the developer of DeepSea, long-term collaborator that I keep on having fun with studying behaviors, whereby we provide a framework where we use distances that have been developed by two mathematicians that essentially relate subspaces that do not necessarily have the same dimension. So the gap metric, for example, has the limitation that if two subspaces are of different dimensions, then the distance is maximal. And this is annoying because in many instances, you would see that, at least one direction is shared. So you would imagine that one of the directions defining, if you like, the subspace, that this is better than, having no direction shared. And yeah, so we recently find out that there exist metrics for subspaces of different dimensions. You have to use extremely hardcore mathematics, doubly infinite Grassmannians that I don't think is worth discussing. But it turns out that, again, angles come to the rescue and seem to be the natural way of measuring distances between subspaces. I hope to see applications of these concepts in the future. We provided in the paper that is coming out an anomaly detection example, but I believe that that's not the end of the story, hopefully.
So this paper that Alberto wrote with Jeremy Coulson has now been published in Control System Letters. I'm going to link it in the description because this is, in my opinion, an extremely cool paper. Whilst I still have no idea what a doubly infinite Grassmannian is, I did find the paper extremely readable, with the hardcore maths being interspersed by interesting remarks and also a very lovely figure illustrating what Alberto has just described for the case of 2- and 3-dimensional subspaces. Also, the paper addresses the question of how to naturally encode the trade-off between complexity and misfit when modelling a system, which is something that Jan Willems had previously commented on the importance of. So that was Alberto's upcoming CDC paper, but for the minute, I had a few more questions about his original paper on defining the gap between finite time systems. One of the things I found particularly exciting in this paper is that it gave a way to kind of compute the gap metric directly from data, because I've used a classical gap metric and my approach has just been kind of roughly approximating it. So could you give an idea of how you can compute the gap from data?
Yeah, so I guess the underlying idea is the following. So under some assumptions on some data that I gather from a system, if I organize that data in a certain way, let's say a Hankel matrix, for example, under the assumption that the data is persistently exciting of a certain order, then the matrix itself, or the image of that matrix, is representative of the behavior of the system over a finite horizon. So if I again collect data from two different systems, and I organize it in that way, and I compute the singular value decomposition of these two matrices. If I take the U factor, so the leftmost factor in this decomposition, and I compute the angles, which is basically done by multiplying the transpose of one of the two together and looking at the singular values, then you have a way of computing the largest angle between the two systems, and therefore also the sine of the largest angle, and therefore the distance. And it turns out that you do also have a system theoretic interpretation of that. So I find this very cool. It seems the most natural way of comparing systems.
Just very quickly before we move on, if anyone listening would like to understand more about how this works but isn't familiar with singular value decomposition, I would highly recommend Steve Brunton's video series on this, which gives a very great overview of both the maths and intuition behind singular value decomposition. Okay, I'm kind of wary of time. I'd like to ask you some questions about inControl, so your podcast. So I guess I've mentioned to you before that inControl was a big motivator for me starting this podcast.
It's so meta.
What motivated you to begin inControl?
This is the question that I received the most. It's very funny. So I was scratching my own itch. This is the response. So I think it was about at the time when I was in Cambridge, so 2018, more or less. No, probably before that. I'd been listening to a bunch of podcasts, mostly related about climbing or coffee or other interests of mine. And I had been seeing that new podcasts were surfacing about machine learning. So I was quite excited because I was like, okay, at some point a control podcast will arise and I'll be, I'm a control geek. So I'll be gladly following. And the podcast was not coming, so I, waited for maybe 6 months, a year. And then I started saying, wouldn't it be nice to my peers at Cambridge, wouldn't it be nice if there was a control podcast? And the reactions I got were not particularly impressed. Most of the times I would receive comments like, well, who the hell do you think is ever going to listen to a control podcast? And nowadays, this is extremely funny. I can see that, there is a genuine interest in the subject around the world based on the few metadata that I can see from the inControl website. The podcast now is being listened by a lot of people around the world. Approximately 3,000-4,000 people listen to every episode. Originally, I thought about developing it during my time in Cambridge, but I didn't have the means, or I didn't know how to do it. So I let it sink for a while. Then after COVID, I saw that there was this outreach fund, I think given by IFAC, if I'm not mistaken, or IEEE CSS. I know that I think
there are a few different ones.
There are a couple.
Yeah.
So I remember, spending quite a bit of time, studying how does one develop a podcast, studying about sound engineering, which I knew nothing about. Very fascinating, by the way, because of course there's a lot of connections to, Fourier theory and, things that as electrical engineers we have seen in one way or another. I applied to some of these outreach awards and failed. And failed blatantly. I got rejected, I think, once or twice by both of them. And so I thought, okay, this is really not something that will fly. Nobody has an interest in a podcast. And then I think it was the second day of my second postdoc at ETH, possibly the first time I met Florian Dorfler in his office. And I tell him about this project. I tell him, look, this is something that I really want to do, whether you want to support it or not. This is where I'm going to spend my time. And I was very pleased to see that he was very enthusiastic about it. From day zero, he was on board and he was like, tell me what you need, and we'll try to make that happen. Luckily, also at the same time at ETH, there was this research center that had been started, and CCR Automation, to which I'm extremely grateful, because the podcast would not have been possible without it. They've all been extremely supportive. I have to name a few names: Elise Kahar, Linda Seward, Frederick Banis, Ben Savicki, a number of people. I apologize to those that I'm not mentioning because it was really a collective effort. And so, after some, studying again about, what could I do about sound engineering, etc., we purchased the equipment. And I think the first guinea pig, if I remember correctly, was precisely Florian Dorfler. And then we started thinking about, okay, the prehistory of control and many other subjects. I pushed through, and today this is a project that I'm very proud of because I think it has a lot of value, regardless whether it's been let's say rewarded by things like citations or at least it's not bringing me anything that is useful for tenure, or I don't know whether it is. But I think it's doing a big service to the community. I truly believe we have to do a better job at doing what people in machine learning do. So selling how crazy interesting is our field and what we do every day. So I'm very happy to have seen that you have also started a similar initiative.
I wanted to quickly use this as an excuse to thank the people who supported my early podcasting endeavours, particularly as when I started I was far less prepared than it sounds like Alberto was. So, in particular, Chris Freeman, Zahor Belkatir and Matt Turner, all of whom agreed to be guinea pigs without really knowing what it would entail. Yeah, I guess I've got kind of a lot of related questions. What's your favourite part about making the podcast?
Oof. I would say the favorite, but also the most painful one is studying. Because every episode forces me to study basically the whole career of giants in the field. So there's a lot of reading involved. But at the same time, it forces me to learn things that I hadn't learned before. So that's certainly the most interesting part for me and the most rewarding. As I said, also the most painful because most of the times I have to read like at the very least 20, 30 papers, all of which are quite dense and possibly require notions that I don't know or that I'm not familiar with. So I'm sure that you're familiar with the sensation. It is also challenging sometimes, especially in terms of time. But yeah, very rewarding.
Can you give any kind of hints on future guests or people you'd like to have on the podcast but maybe haven't organised that yet?
I think it would be inelegant not to name specific names, but a few names that I certainly would like to mention are Rudolf Kalman and Jan Willems. These two are too important not to, and even George James. These are three figures that I believe have shaped the field in an incredible way. Unfortunately, none of them is still alive, but in my opinion deserves a dedicated episode. I did two episodes so far, two solo episodes so far that I'm proud of, not because because of the outcome, but because of the fact that I was forced again to read the biography, read what they have done. And I'm talking about Norbert Wiener and Richard Pedman, which I think have shaped the field immensely as well. As I said, three figures that I would like to cover at some point are certainly George James, that I consider to be one of the pioneers of the input-output way of thinking, Rudolf Kalman as a pioneer of the state-space approach, and Jan Willems as a pioneer of the behavioral approach to systems theory.
Before moving on, I just wanted to point people in the direction of my favourite inControl episodes. So, firstly, the recent episode with Miroslav Kristic, probably because I was a massive fan of his work before listening to the episode, and it was super interesting to hear where all of his ideas came from and the stories behind them. Also, the episodes with Trifon Giorgio for a similar reason that one of his papers was kind of the foundation of the first year or so of my PhD. So again, great to hear how that idea came from. And then finally, one from a few years ago with Mustafa Kamash on synthetic biology and cybergenetics, which I remember listening to on holiday and just getting so excited about. Okay, I have a few kind of quick fire questions at the end, if that's all right. What is your favourite part of your job?
I thought about this deeply, actually, because, at some point one always sees the happy endings. Now I do have a job at the University of British Columbia, but at the same time I had a path that led me to becoming a professor quite late, and therefore thinking that, this may not be the path that I would reach simply because I was too old. And this is one of the biases that is typically not being discussed among the other many biases in our field and in science that we should focus a bit more on. And I say this in relation to the question, what is the favorite part of your job? The favorite part of my job is probably mentoring younger people. Where do I find value? That's the reason why I said to myself, I want to continue and push through and try to become an assistant professor, because that's actually what I care about, or at least where I think I can make a bigger impact. Obviously, research is the other part of my job that I love. Finding something, a new perspective on something must be deeply satisfying if you're doing this job. Otherwise, you probably should be doing something else, I feel. These are the two things that I find most enjoyable, for sure.
Who is your role model within kind of control or mathematics?
I would say there are many, and again, it would be a bit inelegant to single out certain people, also because then by comparison you would say the others were not that inspiring. So I don't want to single out certain people. What I can say though is that in an interesting way, every single person that I met in my journey has played a role. So what I can say in relation to this is that every interaction matters. And it's quite fascinating, again, as a systems and control theorist, because interaction is really key, not only in the physical world, but also in the more interpersonal world.
Okay, final question. What's been your favorite paper or project to have worked on?
It's always the last one. So typically, and this is something that I consistently see also in the guests of my show, what they're most excited about is either what they have just done or what is coming next. And I can totally relate to this. It's the same thing for me.
Thank you so much for the interview. It's been amazing talking to you.
It's been fantastic to be on the other side for once. Thank you for inviting me.
So once again, we've covered a load of different topics in this episode, but just to summarize a few key takeaways. So, in order to construct a reduced order model using moment matching, the external signal generator must be persistently exciting, and this can be ensured by checking whether the system is almost periodic. Behavioral systems representations apply to not only linear systems, but also convex, conical, and affine systems, which are useful in a variety of different contexts, such as linearizations, circuit theory, and constrained mechanical systems. Behavioral systems theory gives a way of representing a system as a set of interconnections, and this structure can be used to improve the computational tractability in a wide range of different problems. The distance between behaviours can be defined in terms of angles between subspaces, and this concept can be extended to define the distance between systems of different dimensions. And finally, the inControl podcast took a little while to get started, but I think I speak on behalf of the control community as a whole to say that we're very glad it did. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you did, please feel free to like, subscribe, and connect with the podcast on LinkedIn. Also, go check out Alberto's podcast, inControl, if you haven't already. I doubt Coffee and Control would exist at all without him trailblazing as wonderfully as he does. Next month, I will be interviewing a researcher at the University of Bristol about her work on quantum control, which is extremely exciting. I cannot wait. But until then, I hope you have a really great month.